Terry, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for uniting with us in the fight against child abuse. You and I are both here because we believe that childhood trauma shouldn't have to define the trajectory of a human being's life.
That's right.
It is a journey. Even if there is intervention, even if there is therapeutic work that's done, it's a journey from childhood trauma to living a self-empowered life. It would be really helpful to just understand about your childhood and where you had to come from to get to where you are today.
Yes. Well, first of all, I grew up and, I was a product of two different, very, very different dynamics. The one was my father was addicted to alcohol, and my mother was addicted to religion. So, when I was a young man, I was not allowed to do things that normal people would do. Like, I wasn't allowed to go to the movies, I wasn't allowed to dance, I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music. So I wasn't allowed to play sports. It was very, very um, restricting, should I say? And then my father, however, was a very abusive alcoholic. And growing up, one of my earliest memories at 5 years old was watching my father hit my mother in the face as hard as he could, and he knocked her out. Um, and it was, these are the moments that would define my childhood all the way up, literally until I was a grown man. I mean, you know, to watch him hit my mother was one thing, but the things he would say and the things and the attitudes that I saw in the house that were very, very disrespectful, um, just it put a pall on the whole household. And when I was a young man, I was so traumatized by waking up to violence, waking up to bleeding and police and you know um, ambulances and just panic that I wet the bed until I was 14 years old. I mean, it was one of those things that my dreams were always haunted. I didn't know. I felt no peace, and that's a reality. That affected everything about me. It affected a lot of my mentality. And another thing I want to say is that hurt people. I I have to say, I became a toxic person simply because of never actually dealing with the pain that I endured as a young man and as a kid. And it's inevitable unless there's an intervention, unless there's help, unless there's a way to really put a pause button on a lot of these bad things. These cycles tend to continue through generations, which can really, really affect everybody around you.
I mean, 100%. As you're talking about the instability and the constant repetitive trauma, waking up and not knowing if someone might be dead.
Yep.
Not only is that trauma just, I mean, life altering, then we're talking about, a childhood, right? Like, that's supposed to be the innocent formative years. And so when that trauma is introduced at such a young age, it plays a huge role in how a human being sees themselves and how they see the world. What was your experience from that transition from child victim to adult trying to figure out how you could be your own man in the world?
Wow. Let me tell you, I was scared all the time, Sasha. I mean, I don't remember a time where I wasn't fearful. Um, Very, very afraid, never felt safe. And I remember, watching television and seeing happy families, like, fictional families like the Brady Bunch or the Partridge Family, and just going, wow, I wish I had that. Like, just looking at them as and marveling at the peace that they enjoyed. I mean, I remember thinking that one of the kids on those shows should be hit for saying something like that. You know what I mean? These are things that you go, oh my God, like, oh no, I would get smacked. There's no way I would get away with even questioning what was going on in my household. My father, by any intents and purpose, just by the fact that he got out of small, tiny Edison, Georgia, and had a job at General Motors, was he considered himself very successful. But yet he would terrorize, our household. And I want to be really clear about this too, because at this time, in this time and day, and also we're talking about within the culture I was in, you owned your family as a man. You basically, your wife was property. Your kids are property. It's no different than if you were to whip a animal that got out of place or out of line. It was nothing to him to feel like he needed to keep us in line and keep my mother in line, and be it through abuse, be it verbally or physically. And what happens is a loss of sense of self. You know what I mean? Like I had no control. And what I found is that I was doing that to my own family once I grew up and had a family. And I was basically, I never hit my wife, but there were many, many times that I viewed my family as property, as my, these are my family. And, the way is like, if it's not my way, it's the highway. Um, I would go off on any little thing. And I felt like that was part of being a man. I felt like because I was a man, I was more valuable than all the women in my life. And it's just self-destructive, man, because you're truly only half a man.
But that's what's so incredible about you, Terry, is like you came from such a traumatic childhood. And through that trauma, these toxic learnings, were a part of your upbringing. And it takes a lot for a human being to be willing to not only look at at themselves and take responsibility for their actions, but it takes even more courage and strength to rewind back into the past and look at those painful, unhealed traumas and confront them. The work that you've had to do to own your pain and confront it so that you can move forward healthfully is incredible. And I'm really curious to know what that therapeutic process was. How do you go from being repressed by and controlled by that trauma to a place where now you can talk about it and move forward in a way that helps others?
It's a little bit, a lot of like the 12-step program. You know what I mean? When you realize you've lost control over your life, that was the moment for me, when my wife basically walked out and she said she had enough. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm successful. I've done I've checked all the boxes, so to speak. You know what I mean? And she was just like, no, there's, you know, you need help. And what I have to say is that part of the upbringing that I had when I talked about the serious ramifications of what the religiosity was, is that all therapy was viewed as demonic when I was a kid. It was viewed as quackery. In the culture I grew up in, it was like if you ever saw a doctor for your mind, you were already crazy. So when you're talking about the help you needed was actually demonized. That was a really, really hard thing to overcome, because you feel like you're disappointing God Himself if you go to a doctor and talk about your problem. So it was I mean, you're talking about a big, big whammy for me. But as an adult, I was able to just try it. And you have to understand, when I first went to therapy, I thought, this is not me. This is crazy. There's no way. this is me. And then the guy says, he says, is your dad an alcoholic? I was like, yeah, yeah. And he said, is your mother religion? I was like, yeah. How did you know? I mean, all this, when they started reading my mail, and I was going, wait a minute, that is me. That is me. And I do have this problem. And they were like, Terry, you have a double life. I was like, what? Wait a minute, what? And they just started to call these things as they were, which forced introspection. It was literally like, I had a movie in my head that was, Dirty Harry. You know what I mean? And I was the hero. But then you look back and you say, wait a minute, Dirty Harry was killing a lot of innocent people. And you look back and you go, wait a minute, this movie is telling the wrong message. And I said, holy cow, I had this whole thing backwards. And the only way I can really relate it to is that it was like thinking that the sun revolved around the earth and then finding out that nope, we go around the sun. It all looked the same, but holy cow, did that not, when I say it was shed, it's revolutionary. I was going, I had it all wrong. And then that began my quest. And I just kept digging and kept digging. And through tons of tears, tons of introspection, tons of examining, and tons of forgiveness. That's another thing that enabled me to move on. Because one reason I was angry is because I never forgave. I mean, if you were on my list, you were always my enemy. You know what I mean? Um, this stuff comes from all that, those 18 years I spent in my parents' house. There were good times that kept us together, but then there were horrors that definitely affected me forever.
Man, I mean, like, I'm so like happy for you and for Rebecca and for your family that you're at a place now where maybe there's more peace and now the ability to move forward with so much more self-awareness, ownership of one's true narrative instead of projected false narratives.